afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeremy Richards, and I'm here today again with Rebecca.
Hello, everyone.
And we are here excited as ever to talk to you about U.S. immigration. And today we are talking about E2 visas. And we do a lot of E2 visas. I think it's a great visa option. Rebecca's done a ton of E2 visas. We've handled some crazy e-visa cases where individuals have maybe had bad representation before, and we've helped them get out of some e-visa situations, but also helping people identify the proper visa type for their business. I think that's the most important thing we want to discuss today as we get into this discussion about E2 visas. And if you watched any of our webinars, if you're familiar with Richards and Jurusik or Rebecca or myself and what we do U.S. immigration, but we primarily deal with Canadians. Doesn't mean we can't help you if you're not Canadian, but our expertise does lie with helping Canadian citizens navigate this process. And we deal a lot with the Toronto consulate, which happens to be one of the busiest consulates actually in the world for E2 visas. So we have a lot of E2 visa experience dealing with Canadians in the consulate in Toronto. So we're going to dive right in. If I can get my slides to work. All right. So today, what we are going to cover: why should you as a Canadian consider the E2 visa? What are those eligibility requirements that you need to make sure that you have? What does the investment structure look like for an e-visa? And that's very important. The E2 visa is an investor visa. So investment is a key component of that. The source of the funds for your investment and the commitment of those funds, two other key aspects of the e-visa: the business plan component, what a qualifying enterprise is, filing with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services versus filing at the U.S. consulate in Canada. All new e-visas are done through the consulate in Toronto, which is crazy. So no matter where you live, if you're on the West Coast, East Coast, you have to go to Toronto to do your initial e-visa. What are those options for E2 visa dependents? The renewal process and the extension process. And then we're also going to get into some of our upcoming webinars as well. So if you're Canadian, why should you consider the E2 visa? Well, the E2 visa, the whole name of the E2 visa the E2 is the designation for investors. So those who are investing in an active business in the United States or who are starting a business in the United States. That's the whole name of an E2 visa. So in the name, it kind of tells you who should really be thinking about an E2 visa and whether or not the E2 visa would apply to you in your situation. But Canadian nationals are eligible for the e-visa because of a treaty between the United States and Canada. So that makes Canadians eligible for E2 status. You cannot qualify for an E2 visa unless your country is actually one of the designated countries on this treaty list. And Canadians are fortunate enough that they are listed on there. Now, you have to be a national of Canada, in other words, a citizen of Canada. That doesn't have to be your only nationality. You can be a nationality of another country as well, but you have to be a Canadian citizen in order to qualify for E2 status. So you can't do so as a permanent resident. You can't do so if you have a visa in Canada. You have to be a Canadian citizen. Some of the benefits of the E2 visa is the investment type is very flexible. And the range of investment is also very flexible. The amount of money that you have to invest to secure an e-visa. You can start at a low threshold to a high threshold. It's really relative to the type of business that you're investing in the United States and another component of job creation. But it's relatively flexible as far as that investment and what that looks like to qualify for E2 status. It gives you the ability to work and live in the United States, to manage and direct your enterprise, your investment. That's the whole purpose for the e-visa. This is a business-based visa, and you need to keep that in mind when you're considering the e-visa. The reason you get this e-visa is because you have a business that you need to run and operate and manage in the United States, that you need to oversee, that needs your active involvement in it. Now, that could look very differently for different people. It could mean that you have to be here 300 days a year, or it could mean you only have to be here for 3 days a year. But your primary purpose for getting this e-visa is to manage your investment in the United States. It is a business visa. It is not a visa that is designed to help you and your family move to the United States. That's not the purpose of an e-visa. Now, is that a benefit that comes along with e-visa? Absolutely it is. So dependents of an e-visa holder, the spouse, and you have to be married. So this is a legal spouse would qualify as a dependent, and any unmarried children under the age of 21 may also qualify for e-status. A spouse obtains authorization to work in the U.S. and the children can come and join them. So those are some benefits of it. But remember, those benefits are incidental to the status. That's not the primary purpose you want to get this visa. Primary purpose is to do business. And the e-visa opens up opportunities across the United States. And that's where a lot of individuals want to get into the e-visa. The United States is a large market, much larger than Canada, about 10 times the size of Canada as far as market space. So it opens up a lot more business opportunities across the United States when you come into the US market. So if you want to tap into the US business market, maybe you're already doing business in Canada and you want to get into the US, the e-visa is a great option to help you get there. Now, the core requirements. Again, reiterating what I just said, you have to be a citizen of a qualifying treaty country in order to qualify for the E2 visa. And Canadians qualify, so you're on the list. So that's part of the requirement, being a Canadian citizen. Now, this next one, real operating commercial enterprise in the United States, it has to be a real business. And people sometimes get caught up on this one. You cannot have the idea of doing business. I think that's the best way to put it. If you want to do business eventually in the United States and you've set aside, let's say $500,000 because you have this idea that you're going to run this business in the United States, you know, the dream of doing business in the US, that is not sufficient for an e-visa. It has to be a real operating company. You can't just reserve money to do business one day in the United States once you get a visa that's going to allow you to come to the US. No, you have to actually commit to this business ahead of time. You actually have to invest in that business before they will give you the visa. And that investment must be substantial in relation to that business, meaning the amount of money that you put into that business is sufficient to guarantee the successful operations of that company in the United States, that you made the level of commitment that when the consulate's reviewing that application, they can see that you put enough funds into this business that it's going to be a real operating substantial investment in the United States, that all of the paperwork is in order to run this company, meaning if it's a company that needs licensure, that you have all state licensures to operate the business. Any lease agreements must need to be signed. Anything that would be necessary for this business to be successful in the United States has to be done before you apply for the visa. You can't apply for the visa first and then go and obtain these things later. And that's what it means to be real and operating and have that substantial investment. It means all of these pieces are in place. So when you show up with your paperwork at the consulate and everything's submitted to the consulate can see how much money you've actually put into the business. They can see that you've taken all necessary steps. The sign's hung up on the door. You've already committed your marketing expense. You've already bought the inventory. All of the office furniture's in place. If you need a truck, a delivery truck, or whatever it might be, that truck is purchased. You have the sign on the truck. This business is ready to go. The second they hand you that passport and you enter the United States, they want to see you ready to hit the ground running. You cannot apply for the visa until all of those steps are taken. And I think that's one of the biggest roadblocks that people run into. They have all this money, but they're not quite ready to commit yet. They're not ready to take that money out of the bank account and buy the vehicle or purchase the building or purchase the inventory. That's too early. If you're not ready to make that commitment yet, if you're not ready to spend those funds to actively get this business up and running off the ground, if it's a new one, then you're too early for the e-visa. You have to do that first. Or if it's an existing business that you're buying, you have to have signed on the dotted line and committed to purchase the business and become the owner. Once you've purchased it, then you're ready for the e-visa. And you must be coming into the United States to develop and control that enterprise. Meaning, and our rule of thumb is greater than 50%. So you have to be, or the company has to be at least 50% owned by Canadians. So the ownership of the company has to match the treaty country. Very important. So here we're dealing with Canada. The majority owners of the company also have to be Canadian. And anybody coming to the United States under e-visa status must also be Canadian. Only Canadians in that Canadian enterprise that is majority Canadian owned can qualify for the e-visa. So very important thing to understand. So it has to be controlled by Canadians in order for it to work if you're going through Canada as the treaty country. And the last component here is it can't be marginal. Well, what is marginal? I think the best example here is you want to come in the United States, you want to buy a bunch of rental properties, you want to rent them out. And we hear that a lot. Oh, I'm going to come into the US, I'm going to do some Airbnbs, I'm going to rent them out. And I'm just going to get a passive income on that. That does not work. That is what is considered marginal. Well, what is marginal? That means you're just making a living for yourself. You're just doing this for personal gain. A component of the E2 visa, sure, we want you to make money, we want you to come and be successful in the United States, but you must also create jobs for US workers. That is an active requirement of the e-visa. If this investment is just for you and for your family for personal gain, it's not going to qualify for an e-visa. You have to also show that you will be hiring US workers. And that requirement is that it has to have the present or future capacity to employ US workers. Well, what does that mean? Well, if it's an existing enterprise and you already show on paper that it already has 3-4 employees in the US, well, it has the present capacity to employ them because you can show it's already employing US workers. Well, if it's a new company and there's no employees on the books yet, well, you need a business plan that lays out over the next 5 years how many employees you're going to hire year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, that you are going to be growing the business, that you are going to be hiring US workers. So very important component of the e-visa. It's not just for you and your family, but you need to create those jobs for US workers. Investment structure. All right, so when you're starting a new business or acquiring an existing business, we hear that a lot. Well, what is the better option? Should I start a new business or should I acquire a business? I think Rebecca has her own thoughts on this as well as me. And anybody that's ever dealt with an e-visa, I'm going to tell you hands down, I'll take the existing enterprise all day long over a new enterprise. Why? Well, an existing enterprise, for the purposes I just stated, you're going to have employees already on payroll. You're going to have tax returns. You're going to have lease agreements. You're going to have signage. You're going to have all this proof that this business is active and operating. One of those key components of the e-visa. You're also going to show it's not marginal because it already has employees on payroll. And then you're also going to have hopefully the substantial investment component because you purchased this existing business, which is going to require a substantial amount of capital. And at least if you've bought at least 50% of that business, well, then you're going to meet that requirement. So I'll take an existing business all day long over a new business. Now, it doesn't mean a new business isn't an option. We do those all the time too. But it just means that you have to have a lot more thought and support behind a new business. You need to have a really good business plan, and you make sure you've taken all those necessary steps, licensure and everything that I already mentioned. All those things have to be in place. And you have to commit all these funds up front in a business that's not even operating yet before you get your visa. Whereas an existing company where you maybe are putting $200,000 into it, but if it's already operating, you might have a manager and employees and it's already making money for you as you're waiting to get your visa. So it's much easier to swallow that type of investment than it is to sink all this money into a business and then wait several months before you get a visa to even be able to go in and operate that business. Most of the time for a new business, we see people buying into franchises. And those are good new investments because when you're buying into a franchise, you have an established plan of how that franchise is going to be developed and to grow and to hire employees. So both of them work. There's a lot more planning that goes into a new versus existing. Same requirements, but you have to look at them under a different lens because of those factors. And because of that, the concept applies a little bit more scrutiny on that new versus existing. Because the existing, you have all the paperwork there that shows this business is already operating. Substantial component. Now that is an equation that the consulate uses to determine whether or not the amount of money you put into that company would be considered sufficient. They do not give a dollar amount, but at the same time, they kind of do. They give you like this funky equation to determine whether or not the amount of money you put into the business would be considered substantial. And they throw this $100,000 out there. Meaning if your investment is $100,000 or less, or somewhere in that $100,000 range, you as the investor better have 100% of that investment. You better be 100% in on that investment. And then that would be considered substantial for that business. So if you bought a hair salon, for example, and we've done these, let's say a hair salon costs $65,000. And that's the initial investment. And you did 100% of that investment as the investor, that would be considered substantial for that type of business. But now let's move to the opposite end of the spectrum. Let's say you bought into a manufacturing company, and that manufacturing company has a $10 million price point, and you put $1 million into that manufacturing company. Well, $1 million into a $10 million investment would also be considered substantial, also taking into account that you must have at least 50% ownership in that enterprise as well. So it's all in relation to what you are investing in. That's where the substantial comes from. And it changes. There is no hard and fast rule of what that is. It's all in relation to the type of business that you're investing in and how large that investment amount is. And the investment must be enough relative to the cost of enterprise, the proportionality concept. And I'll give the example of one that we were working on recently. If you're buying into, for example, a restaurant bar, and this restaurant bar does annual revenues of, $500,000 a year, and you're buying into that restaurant or bar, and you're buying in at $50,000, and you're getting 50% of the business. That is not proportional. $50,000 for a restaurant or bar that's doing $500,000 a year. There's something off in that equation. Your investment is not relative to that cost of that enterprise. So the amount that you're investing in that business for the percentage of ownership needs to be consistent. You can't just give a token amount of money, such as $50,000 for a $500,000 business. The consulate's going to look at that. They're going to do this proportionality test, and they're going to say, something's off here. This is not a legitimate arm's length transaction. So all of the paperwork must line up in these transactions. The consulate is going to review them, and they're going to substantiate everything that you're doing here. And that's where that proportionality rule comes in. I want to make sure that the money that you're putting into this business is enough and relative to the investment. In other words, what you're getting in return for the money you're putting in. And the last component is this business going to offer real job creation and growth potential for not only you as the investor, but again, going back to jobs for US citizens. This must be a viable business opportunity in the United States that has a likelihood for success and the likelihood to either employ U.S. workers today or in the near future. And you have to be able to show that through your business plan. All right. And stop me when I'm. Is this my last one, Rebecca? When do I go? This slide. All right. So step 2: source of funds and risk commitment. So very important. All these aspects of the e-visa are important. You can't overlook any of them. And I know I've said that. Oh, this is very important because they all are. And if you miss any of these components of the e-visa and you're going through this process, it could result in denial of the application by just missing and misunderstanding one of these components. So the source of the funds and risk of commitment of those funds. The money that's being invested must be the investor's own money. And it has to have been obtained from a lawful source. And that could be through your employment, that could be through a business that you own, it could be from a gift, it can be from the sale of a home, any legitimate source of funds. Maybe you sold some stock, maybe it's a retirement account. The options are really endless for legal source of the funds, but it must be the investor's own money. And you have to be careful here. If you have joint property with somebody, for example, and it's you and your spouse on the account, well, you have to show that it's your funds that's being invested, not your spouse's funds, for example. If you got money from your parents, you have to show that maybe that was a gift from your parents, that where you got the money is important. And you have to show that it's your own money that's at risk and that you obtain those funds lawfully. Okay, so you have to be the personal guarantor of those funds. And as the investor, you personally must be at risk for loss if this business goes south. So if this business fails, you as the investor must have the potential for loss. And that's the best way to look at it, that you are personally at risk if this business goes south. And they have to be able to tie all of these funds back to you as the investor in that risk in this investment. And as far as the commitment of these funds, anything that you put into this business, I kind of look at it from a tax perspective. If you think of it from an accounting and taxation perspective, any legitimate business expense would count towards your e-visa. You can't put in personal expenses and then try to pass it off as a business expense. So anything that if you have to lease a building, rent a building, buy equipment, buy furniture, marketing expenses, signage, anything that would legitimately be a cost for doing business and starting or running that type of a business. If it's a delivery business, maybe you need a vehicle, maybe you need to wrap that vehicle with, some marketing material, whatever it is that would be a legitimate business expense. All of these costs can be used as part of your commitment to this investment. So paying attention to everything that you spend and tracking all of these items, making sure that you have the bank account statements, making sure that you have copies of all purchase agreements, that if there are any canceled checks or transfers of funds, you have to trace all of it. And they're going to go back to every transaction, and all of these transactions have to line up chronologically as well. If you made an investment, 5 years ago, but then the money just popped into your account 2 weeks ago, they're going to be, wait, how did you make the investment back then, but then you just got the money today, or vice versa? All of these transactions have to line up. And they're going to check all of your receipts. They're going to check all of your purchase agreements, your lease agreements, all your sales transactions, whatever it is, to make sure that the source of funds lines up, that your investment timing all lines up, that all of this stuff makes sense from an investment perspective. And some things that we see that individuals run into when they're doing e-visas, that they don't have any real business expenses, that they haven't committed the funds to the business, I think is the biggest one that we see. We get people that show up to us with $100,000 in their bank account, and they want to say, I want to apply for an e-visa because I potentially want to make this investment in the future. Putting money in a bank account again and not committing it, not purchasing the equipment, not purchasing the building, not actively investing in that enterprise does not count towards an investment. Having that passively sitting there, not committed, will not count for e-visa purposes. So you have to be all in when you're going for the e-visa route. You cannot just sit back on money and say, I have, this money reserved that's going to then potentially be used for this business in the US. No, you actually have to commit those funds. You have to write the check. You have to sign on the dotted line. That transaction must be complete for the consulate to then accept that as a commitment towards this investment in the United States. So very important to track your source of funds. Where did you get the money? It was lawfully obtained. And then you have to have a paper trail that tracks all the transactions and everything that's going towards this investment. And it has to be at risk, meaning you spent that money. It's committed towards this business. And you have to prove all of that to the consulate.
All right, so the business plan, as Jeremy identified, it's a very, very crucial part of these types of applications, and they're especially helpful when you're starting a business from scratch with no operations or no employees. This plan creates a narrative of the investment and your operations. It includes market projections and your potential for job creation. It covers everything. Some of these business plans we see, they can be 20 to 50 pages long. That's how in-depth they are. These plans are meant to lay out your strategy over the next 5 years to grow your business and demonstrate that to whoever you're applying with, whether it be USCIS or the consulate. Many times these business plans include an investment summary explaining where you spent your money and what different category it was allocated to. They're very detailed and a critical component of these E2 applications. The business plans also identify the enterprise as a real and active for-profit business that is going to be offering goods or services. And it demonstrates that you're not just going to be passively owning the enterprise. You are going to be actively operating it and having a key role in developing the business. Another key element is the discussion on ownership and control. Again, it must be clearly identified that the principal investor has at least 50% ownership or operational control of the enterprise. That's how you show that you have the ability to direct it and make those key decisions. You want to avoid creating a one-person business that has minimal operations and that only supports the investor's lifestyle. That is just not a good investment plan to have. Again, it needs to not be marginal and be able to support U.S. workers in your company. Now, moving on to the next one, talking about filing with USCIS versus the consulate. Now, when you're filing with USCIS, this is only available if the investor applicant is already in the US in lawful status. So say you came as a visitor and you want to change your status to an E2. What you do is you file Form I-129, which is that petition for a non-immigrant worker, and you request that E2 classification. Now, the processing time for these cases in the US with USCIS is currently sitting at around 10 or more months. It's not a fast process at all. Premium processing is available, of course, for an additional charge, and that will give you a response in 15 business days. And as always, that response will either be a request for evidence or a decision. And as a result of processing with USCIS, you will only receive E2 status, not a visa stamp. So this means that you must reapply at the consulate if you ever need to leave the US and wish to re-enter, again, as an E2 investor. This is different from the usual process for Canadians where you are visa exempt and you never have to step foot in a consulate. But E2s and even the E1s are different. They require an actual visa to be issued in your passport. With the consulate, applying this way is the most common route, especially for Canadian citizens. You file the E2 package directly with the consulate, and for all first-time applications, you have to apply at the US consulate in Toronto. So unfortunately, if you are from anywhere else in the country, you may be taking a little road trip or have to fly some distance to Toronto there. When processing at the consulate, an in-person interview is always required. There are no waivers. At that interview, if you are going to be approved, they take your passport and they issue you that E2 stamp, which will then allow you to more freely travel to and from the US. Now, E2 visa dependents. So as Jeremy touched on earlier, spouses and unmarried children under 21 qualify as dependents of the E2 visa holder, and as a result, they can get their own visas as well. One important thing to consider is that dependents also need to have the same nationality as the principal applicant. So you all must be Canadian citizens. Dependents do have the option to apply either at the same time as the principal applicant, or they can file at a later time once that principal applicant has secured their status. That's the most common situation if you're applying at the consulate. If you are processing with USCIS, you would file form I-539 to change your status to that of an E2 dependent. The nice thing is that E2 spouses, you are automatically authorized to work in the US. There's no separate work authorization process required. You don't need that EAD card, and you're able to work for any employer or even start your own business. It's very open-ended. Children, on the other hand, you can study, but you cannot work. And you must change your status once you turn 21. You no longer qualify for that dependent status at that point. And of course, dependent visa validity, it matches the principal applicant's E2 visa period. They're going to grant you the same amount of time. And again, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, this visa is not meant to be a permanent path towards moving your family to the US. The primary purpose is to direct and develop your company that you have invested in. Again, bringing your family here is a nice perk, and being able to work for your spouse is great, but it's not meant to be a permanent pathway here. In terms of the validity, so E2 visas are, for Canadians, they're good for up to 5 years. You're going to be issued a visa stamp with 5 years of validity on it. Usually, renewals are unlimited. You know, you're permitted, so you're permitted to renew as many times as you need to. So after your initial 5 years is up, you can renew again for another 5 years, and so on. Renewals, of course, are all dependent on the business remaining operational and continuing to meet E2 requirements. You still need to prove that your business is active and operating and that you've hired employees. For those renewals, it's not so much a matter of reproving the investment, but showing that you have taken steps to hire US workers. You know, they have W-2s, you have payroll reports, and you've made sufficient revenue, so tax returns for the past few years to show that. You must also obviously continue to develop and direct your company over those 5 years to maintain your E2. You know, you can't step back and kind of take a passive role. You need to actively be involved in the company to maintain your compliance under the E. And importantly, you know, it goes hand in hand with what I just said. Don't let your business, you know, go stagnant or fail to operate as you planned. You know, you should be following that E2 business plan. That business plan isn't just meant to show the consulate what your plans are. It's meant to guide you as well. So again, just showing how crucial that business plan is, and that'll guide you to make sure that you are continuing to meet those E2 requirements over time. So that wraps it up for today. We do have some upcoming webinars about the E1 trader visa and the green card process for spouses. You can scan the QR code at the bottom there to register if you are interested. And if you have any questions, our contact information is on the screen here, or you can scan the QR code to get in contact with our office. Like Jeremy said, we do E2s all the time, and we're happy to consult and get you on your path to starting a business in the US. Thank you everyone for joining today. We'll see you in the next one.